Another week of logjam on legislation. Parliament instead descends into an even deeper divide over Gaza. The Prime Minister labelled reckless, Peter Dutton labelled heartless. Palestinians who fled the war zone say they just want a safe home for their kids. I'm David Spears. Welcome to Insiders. There are only 7 parliamentary sitting weeks left this year, and another one has just ended in frustration for the government. Neither the Coalition nor the Greens would back its move to clean up the CFMEU. The government still has a long list of reforms to pass before this term runs out, but cooperation in Parliament is becoming increasingly difficult. The main game was another ugly fight over the war in Gaza and the security checks on those who fled to Australia.
As strikes fall on Gaza, Peter Dutton is raising the drawbridge.
I don't think people should be coming in from that war zone at all at the moment.
Peter Dutton says they pose a national security threat.
That framing is racist. It really is shameful and beneath our alternative Prime Minister.
You are talking about Hamas, a listed terrorist organisation.
All reasonable people know that not all people in Gaza are members of Hamas.
If they've expressed any support or sympathy for Hamas, is that a problem?
If it's just rhetorical support and they don't have an ideology or support for a violent extremism ideology, then that's not a problem.
Does supporting a listed terrorist organisation like Hamas pass Australia's character test?
If the Leader of the Opposition doesn't have confidence in that system, he should say so.
Supporting a terrorist organisation is a very clear breach of the Migration Act. Now, that's not a criticism of Mike Burgess. He was simply describing the status quo under this government.
Are you a heartless racist? Do you have any humanity?
It's a nonsense and it's emotional language.
The number of people killed in Gaza since Hamas launched the attacks on Israel in October last year has now passed 40,000.
Peter Dutton has laid out a pathway.
Maybe say something about the children that are being slaughtered.
And this politicisation to demonise him because they think this is a way to help their polling, to destroy his reputation, is abhorrent.
Peter Dutton has defended his calls to refuse visas to Palestinian refugees.
And he's claiming the Prime Minister's misled the Parliament.
This is an egregious breach of what is in our country's best interests.
These are families that you are seeking to paint that somehow they are all terrorists. Stop being racist.
Leader of the Opposition.
People like myself came here and, you know, we are not terrorists.
The scarf stayed on, but the mask came off. He sows fear and he sows division.
This is a national security issue and it deserves to be debated.
My guest this morning is the Leader of the Nationals, David Littleproud. First, let's check what's making news. And a new poll we can reveal this morning shows most Australians want a complete ban on gambling advertising, despite government warnings over the impact on TV ad revenues. The poll from JWS Research shows 53% back a complete ban, 27% want ads restricted during live sport, 14% are happy with no further restrictions and 6% don't know. It comes as the government finalises its plans. The 9 newspapers report giant super funds have backed the government's Future Made in Australia scheme and are ready to start spending on local manufacturing projects. The Greens are threatening to derail the plan because they don't want any subsidies or tax breaks going to fossil fuels. I'll ask the Nationals leader about that shortly. The Sun Herald reports the New South Wales Liberals are considering court action against the Electoral Commission after the party's embarrassing failure to submit nomination forms for nearly 140 candidates before the deadline. It now wants an extension. We'll talk more about this extraordinary stuff up a bit later with the panel too. Meanwhile, the Prime Minister's asked Labor's National Executive to take control of the party's pre-selections in all Victorian federal seats, meaning there will be no rank and file ballots. He says the redrawn electoral boundaries there require the federal intervention. It's also understood to be due to concerns over the influence of some unions, including the scandal-plagued CFMEU. We're going to start with the debate over Palestinians fleeing Gaza. None have been coming to Australia for months. The Rafah border crossing remains closed. So should we be worried about those who came earlier? After being allowed by Israel to leave, they were checked against a list of known terrorists and criminals. Not all were subjected to individual ASIO investigations. But it's fair to say the ASIO boss wasn't exactly expressing concern about them endangering Australia's national security when he appeared on this program last week. Let's see what the panel makes of it. We're joined this week by Anna Henderson. Charles Croucher, welcome to the couch. Good to have you here. And Jennifer Hewett, thank you all for joining us. Anna, to you first. Peter Dutton, midweek, responding to what Mike Burgess has said, called for this halt for now on Palestinians fleeing Gaza coming to Australia. Were his concerns justified, or was he unnecessarily whipping up concern, do you think?
It was very harsh to take that view, and I think some of the experts who've been watching this area closely say that it's unprecedented really for someone in that kind of political position to call for such a complete blanket position. There were different comments throughout the week, but one was suggesting this would be until the war is over. So in terms of the time frame of this being suggested, that is considered extraordinary by people who've watched this space carefully. The ASIO boss himself had said that there were delineations about, whether you had rhetorical support as opposed to financial or material backing for Hamas's terrorist ideology. But Peter Dutton doesn't see that grey area. That's his conviction.
Isn't his position, the coalition's position, that as long as the security checks can be improved, they can have face-to-face interviews, then it would be okay? Is that the position?
Potentially with the return of those protection visas as well as some kind of method of getting people in. I mean, this is an argument that is largely about something that isn't happening right now, right? That is so difficult to get people out of Gaza in particular. And if they are coming out, they are watched by most of the world, including by Mossad and by the Israelis. And that will be the best form of vetting, if you like, for any potential refugee. So whether there is actually the practical steps of getting people to Australia, long term there are problems that you can go down. And as Anna said, when there's no time frame put around this, then there's no real indication of exactly what the structured policy is moving forward.
Yeah, and it's worth just explaining, I suppose, what we do know of how the process is working. The government, for understandable reasons, isn't giving all the detail as to what different partners are checking against what. But we do know to leave Gaza, Israel has to give the okay. And Jennifer, they're not letting Hamas terrorists out easily, are they?
They're definitely not letting Hamas terrorists out easily. But I think this is a kind of a very mixed story in terms of the domestic reaction. I think obviously for people who don't particularly like Dutton, this will just confirm their view of him as lacking in compassion, particularly as you see on news every night, all those terrible the scenes of terrible carnage, the small bodies, etc. On the other hand, there are many people in the community, and understandably very concerned, one about social cohesion, but also this builds, of course, on Labor's failures in national security issues with the having to let people out into the community, not being prepared. So a lot of people, they won't necessarily get the details. They'll just go, well, really, are the security checks done? Even though in a practical sense, you could say, look, this is particularly irrelevant now because nobody's coming out, and again, because of Israel. But I think it does, and the fact that Anthony Albanese did actually selectively quote the Director General did not help.
I'll come to that and what happened there. But in terms of, I guess, some of the more heated scenes in Parliament, they involved the independent MP Zali Steggall saying this about Peter Dutton.
We heard you in silence. You can hear me in silence.
Order.
Stop being racist.
Leader of the opposition. Order. Order.
I'm not a racist, and I'm not going to be standing here as a punching bag for people like Zali Steggall. I actually think, ironically, that them calling out people unnecessarily and unrealistically and unjustly as racists, they're actually fueling tensions.
I'm not a racist, you're a racist. And look, some of that did continue outside the chamber as well. It's interesting, the Prime Minister, Labor, they haven't used that label, but Anthony Albanese did list various comments Peter Dutton has made over the years about African gangs, Lebanese migrants and so on. I mean, he's clearly feeding the perception that Jennifer touches on that, this guy has form.
And you think about what back to the ASIO Director General last weekend, this kind of language that could potentially inflame tensions, inflame violence. Peter Dutton, by making this comment, I mean, he has justifiable security concerns to raise. Holding the government to account is important on how it's conducting this process, but he's also chosen to really create a situation where that inflamed language has other things that could follow from it, and I don't think he's really thinking about that, or about the potential that this becomes a criticism of Israel and the security checks it does, as we touched on earlier. I mean, it's Israel that does the initial security check, and I'm told from the Israeli side that they would not be letting anyone out of that country who hasn't gone through the most stringent process in terms of what security issues they may raise.
Yeah, look, Peter Dutton's argument here, Charles, is that the government softened the process. You compare it to what happened with those brought in fleeing ISIS from Iraq and Syria. There were face-to-face interviews, often, well, not a third country, but in the Kurdish zone. That often happened. There was time to do that, and it did take a long time for some of them to come here. Is there anything in that this is actually a different process now?
Potentially, but doesn't this come back to your trust of ASIO? Do you believe that ASIO has the tools they need to get the job done when it comes to security checks, or do you believe that they are taking all the necessary steps to get the job done? Now, Mike Burgess has been one of the most forward-facing, and it's a good thing, director of ASIO, and if he needed more, I think he would have said in some of the several opportunities, they need more time, need more resources, need more opportunities. So it goes back to that front, and on that front, there doesn't seem to be an argument for the blanket ban that Peter Dutton is placing forward.
Well, the comments from Mike Burgess, the Prime Minister quoted, but he selectively quoted in Parliament. He left a little bit out. For the record, here's what Mike Burgess did say on the program last week.
They've gone through a visa. If they've been issued a visa, they've gone through the process. Part of that visa process is where criteria hit. Right. They're referred to my organisation, and ASIO does its thing.
Yeah, so criteria hit is the bit that the Prime Minister left out when he was talking about that in Parliament. I mean, you listen to the PM, it sort of left the impression that everyone's checked by ASIO. Now, clearly they're not.
Yes.
But criteria means there's a problem. That's when they're referred to ASIO.
Yes, but I do think that this still kind of goes to people's just genuine and I think understandable fears about what's happening in society at the moment, whether there's, all the fear of terror attacks and things like that. Now, none of that may be directly related to this, but it just kind of creates a vibe, and that's why I think the reaction domestically will be a bit mixed, because Albanese's been trying to be too smart by half, frankly, on trying to suggest that all of these... Did he mislead
Parliament, do you think?
Well, I think he did mislead Parliament, yes, I do. Now, whether or not that matters, and you do feel very sorry for these people who've had the most extraordinary, terrible times in their lives. They finally got here, and then basically they're being, suggested that there might be a bit of a terrorist risk or something. But I do think that there is a genuine issue about security and the fact that this was all done in a hurry.
Well, more than 7,000 people have had their application rejected. Some of those have been on security concerns. So we know that the government has been working on that front and keen to put out that figure, given 1,500 people have come to Australia. But to your point, Jennifer, to think that there was a 22-year-old medical student who's come out of Gaza, Jamila Idris, who we spoke to this week, who had to say, unprompted on camera, I'm not a terrorist, please show me the evidence. It's kind of extraordinary. That's where the debate has gotten to at the same time as...
It's a very, very ugly debate. But I think the government has been pretty flat-footed in how it's handled this as well.
And the opposition makes the argument that given there have been so many visas that have been knocked back, how are we sure that net has caught everyone? Now, you can make the argument from both sides. One, it's working because you're knocking people back, but two, that's an awful lot to be knocked back.
Yeah, I'm told a lot of those knockbacks aren't necessarily because, they're Hamas terrorists, but because they're looking at whether they're going to overstay their visa and try and remain in Australia, and a lot of those are being knocked back for that reason or some other reason that might on character grounds knock them out. But look, we don't have all the detail.
What you can definitely say is this has not lowered the temperature.
No, it is not.
In any way.
And so Jennifer's touched on a little bit here, but the politics of all of this, how this plays politically, it is a bit mixed. Would you agree? I mean, I think Jennifer's right. It doesn't change the perception of Peter Dutton. He hasn't really done much since being in the job to change that, hard man perception. But I don't know. How do you think it will play politically, Anna?
Well, I think as the new Home Affairs Minister, Tony Burke, steps into that role, he has done, I think, what within his party people consider to be a very good job of showing his credentials and his ability to kind of step up to the table and have that debate with the opposition quite successfully. So I think on that front there's a lot of hope within the Labor caucus that the way this is now going to unfold will be with a position that Labor can take to the electorate that will be well explained and will cut through critically, which is what was the concern before now.
Yeah, there's been a lot of focus on how will this play in seats with high Muslim numbers and seats without many Muslims. Is that the metric to look at this through? Or?
There's two things long term. The first one is if something were to happen into the future, Peter Dutton can look back and say, look, and I warned everyone back at this time, which is the sort of morbid side of it. The practical side may be long term. There's been lots made about the idea of the Muslim voice and the vote in Western Sydney. Now, whether that actually is going to be a huge impact, I'm more dubious. But to actually get a seat, those candidates would almost certainly need Liberal preferences. Given what's just been said, how do you go to the Liberal Party and say, we'll accept your preferences or we'll do your preference deal now? That seems dead in the water. So that's been a pretty good week politically for Tony Burke and Jason Clare, given what's been said.
All right, well, time to talk to the leader of the Nationals, David Littleproud, and to take us there, here was Independent MP Di Lee on how this debate made her feel. She came as a refugee to Australia from Vietnam, and while she agrees on the need for security screening, she is concerned about inflaming tensions in the community.
What if there are families like mine, exactly the same position, but then, you know, in another country like, you know, Australia currently or Canada or US are saying, oh, they're all terrorists. That would mean that I would not have that opportunity to be where I am today. And so that was triggering because it just brought me back to that moment where we escaped.
David Littleproud, welcome to the program.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So do you honestly think terrorists might have slipped through the net and made it to Australia?
Well, what we're saying is that we believe, and Peter Dutton said this, that 99% of the people who bring in this country come with the right intent to participate in our society the way that we expect them and add to our society. We're in no way saying, in any way, shape or form, that we don't still welcome those of the Islamic faith to this country. We're just saying, in a reasonable suggestion by the opposition, that when you're looking at a war zone and the fluid nature of it, that why wouldn't you put in place the programs and the procedures that were put in place in the past to give Australians comfort and give those families, and particularly the bringing children here that want to have a safe existence, that we can promise them that, because we haven't brought someone in that doesn't have the hate that is permeating in some parts of the world to this country and utilises that to tear away at the very safety of our great country.
But fleeing a war zone can often be chaotic, it can be messy, there's not always... And people fleeing Afghanistan didn't have the time for a face-to-face interview and so on. Do you accept here, we're talking about people that Israel approved to leave, Egypt then checked, Australia then checked against its movement alert list, some were even referred to ASIO. There's a few checks along the way.
Well, there is, but they haven't been consistent, and I think what we have proved that while we do rely on some of our partners to help us in some of the intelligence around individuals, it's important for ourselves to also do that around face-to-face interviews, and we showed great compassion, and Peter Dutton himself as an Immigration Minister, in making sure that we could bring those that had faced some of the greatest atrocities, being able to bring them to this country and make sure that they can enjoy a safe country that we do, because someone that doesn't have their intent didn't slip through the net. And I think all we've made is a simple suggestion, and for this a desperate attempt of politicisation by the Prime Minister down to the Teals and the Greens of a suggestion that I don't think is unreasonable. In fact, what the government has done is unprecedented. Peter Dutton is simply going back and making a suggestion of one that we utilise. So why would you turn that into a politicisation?
So the suggestion is the face-to-face interview, right? Is that the one thing that's...
Well, we've made it clear that if the government, and there may be a juncture in the future where we can open up our borders again to those wanting to flee Gaza. At the moment, as you've quite rightly articulated, that can't happen. But why don't we put in place the policies and procedures now that would give us comfort, to make sure no one sneaks in, and that's just common sense. That's what was put out there by Peter Dutton. And
just in common sense, I mean, even after they've gone through all those checks, you think a face-to-face interview is where they might actually admit yeah, I'm actually a terrorist?
Well, I think that is where you allow the experts to be able to interview and to be able to make those assessments. Not an immigration official, when most of these visas, those that are here now, were done on average in 24 hours, some in less than an hour. How can we have confidence that the right decisions and the criteria was hit, as Mike Burgess has said, and the Prime Minister failed to represent him properly in Parliament? How do we know that was done in any way, shape or form? And I think it's reasonable for the opposition to simply ask questions, to put reasonable solutions to make sure we get that comfort, and we're doing more. And we're saying we're prepared to bring them in. We're doing more than what some of Palestine's own neighbours, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, aren't prepared to take any refugees.
Egypt has more than 100,000 Palestinians stuck there at the moment, just to be clear.
Yeah, but there's other countries there that aren't doing as much as Australia, and I think we're still prepared to show that compassion, but we want to make sure that when they come here, they can continue to enjoy the lifestyle that we've got.
And a face-to-face interview would
I think that
do the job that all those other checks can't.
With biometric testing and doing it in third country, and Peter Dutton made that very clear, that that's a sensible way that's worked previously for Australia to give those families that comfort when they come to Australia, that they'll enjoy the lifestyle they're expecting to come and enjoy.
And those who are here already, the 1,300 or so, I mean, how worried are you? Should they be put in detention? What should happen to them?
Well, I think there's an opportunity for the government to be able to demonstrate that we've done appropriate checks. Now, some of those people were brought in, as I said, with visas issued in less than an hour. So we need to make sure that there has been some process that we can get that comfort.
So you're not comfortable at the moment?
Well, they need to articulate that, not just to the opposition, they need to articulate that.
But from what you've heard so far, you're not.
Well, I haven't heard anything. I think this has been more about...
So you're worried about them?
Well, I think it's important, it's a responsibility of the government to articulate that. They'd be more interested in trying to paint Peter Dutton as heartless and racist rather than actually going to the core of their responsibility and giving Australians confidence that the people that we give the privilege to come to this country...
Do you accept the ASIO boss didn't seem too worried about them?
Well, again, if criteria is hit, he sees them. Now, if you're issuing visas in an hour or less than 24 hours, how do we know that the criteria to hit ASIO were met? And that's where
these people have been here months. You don't think ASIO's going to actually look at people they're worried about?
Well, again, that's what I'm saying is I think it's beholden on the government. It's their responsibility to give us all confidence.
And you don't have confidence in that at the moment?
No, that's not what I said at all. I'm saying the government needs to be... That's more than likely been done, but I think it's appropriate that the government gives that confidence to the Australian people and everybody else. That's in essence what Peter Dutton and the coalition has basically said. We've put forward a reasonable suggestion, one that's been used in precedent before. Why would we deviate from that when it's proved to work? And that, I think, sadly, has seen the politics of this just escalate because they saw an opportunity to demonise Peter Dutton's character.
You don't think Peter Dutton was playing politics?
No, it was well, you tell me if that's not a reasonable suggestion to actually put forward a policy that has been utilised before, that has given Australians confidence and comfort about the people we bring to this country. That's our primary responsibility, to keep Australians safe.
Let's move on to some other issues. I want to focus a bit on regional Australia while we've got you here. We saw during the week some pretty concerning NAPLAN figures, particularly for the regions, and this is one of the really stark things you see in the NAPLAN results, this geographic divide. The further you get away from the big cities, the worse the results get for kids. One expert says the results in some remote areas are third world. What would the Nationals do to try and fix these problems?
We're just got to get back to basics. As I get around, even my own electorate, which covers outback Queensland, it's just basically decluttering much of the curriculum. I get feedback from teachers and principals that there's just too much in the curriculum for them to cover, and they're not doing the basics well enough because they don't have the time. I think we need to let the grassroots, which are the teachers out there on the ground, to be able to articulate what's going to work. My father was a teacher, and I can tell you, it's getting back to the basics and giving them the tools, not cluttering the curriculum up. I think the government, in terms of the funding models that they're looking at now and trying to get the states to agree that, it's important that we actually have outcomes tied to funding. And I think that's
back the extra funding.
Well, I think so long as there's caveats and outcomes tied to it. I think as federal governments of all persuasions, we're very quick to say we put big swathes of money into problems, but they're never tied the states to to outcomes. And I think that's very important around our federation. As our federations change, I think the funding that comes from the federal government needs to come with serious outcomes, and I support the government if they're going to continue down that track, but I think we seriously need to look at the curriculum.
The regions often have a lot of skills shortages at the moment. Peter Dutton wants a big cut in the migration intake. What would that mean for the regions?
Well, we're going to say who should come to this country, the skills that they should have, and we're going to encourage them to go to those parts where we do have shortages. That's the tough decisions that a Dutton Littleproud government's prepared to make. In some parts of regional Australia, even in the Northern Territory, in Darwin, we've actually got population decline. We need more skills in there, but we're not going to bring in dog groomers and martial arts instructors. We're going to bring in the people we need and the skills we need. When you've got a housing crisis, you probably might want to bring in a few roofers and tilers and builders and electricians, but also go to some of those skills, particularly in regional Australia, where you can bond them. And what we found from experience when we were in government, if you bond them for 5 to 6 years, invariably they've made a connection with the community and they don't want to leave. And that's how you make sure that regional Australia grows. We have the tools we need by having the human capital we need. And I think that's the common sense decision that we're prepared to make.
And you don't want a reduction in international students at regional unis. Have you convinced Peter Dutton of that?
Well, Peter Dutton's made that very clear even in his budget reply speech, that regional universities be looked at differently. We need to understand they've got a different business model. So they
won't see a reduction?
Well, we're going to work with all the universities to make sure we get that right. But when you look
what does
Sydney,
that mean? Well, there won't be a reduction?
Well, look at Sydney University, for example. I mean, 47% of their students are foreign. They made $1.4 billion from those last year. That's beyond the pale. Regional universities invariably don't have as many foreign students. There's a couple that do, one near me in Toowoomba, but we'll get that balance right, and regional universities will get the priority, is what we've been very clear, but we'll work with all. Before the election, that will be very clear and upfront to everybody, but we won't be bringing 1.67 million people.
On tax, I want to ask your plans here. When you first ran for Parliament, you were a big fan of the idea of zonal taxation. I saw Peter Dutton a couple of weeks ago open the door to the coalition looking at something like this. What are you going to do here? Lower income taxes for people in the regions?
Yeah, well, look, I'm not going to announce the policy today, David. Obviously, you're a very popular show, but not popular enough for me to make an announcement. But look, we're working through a suite of measures. There's already a zonal tax rebate that's in place. It hasn't been touched since the 90s, and so the cost of living in regional areas is significantly greater because of the cost of transport, fuel, and so we want to make sure that we get that policy setting right.
Housing's a bit cheaper though.
It's all relative, but David, you understand the wages and the jobs that they earn aren't as high, and so you've got to understand one of the biggest constraints we also have is childcare accessibility. And I went to the Jobs and Skills Summit when I first became leader and made it very clear of the $4.7 billion they were giving to subsidies to those on $300,000 to $500,000 a year, cut a few dollars to get some more places out in regional Australia so families can go back to work.
Okay, but you will have some lower income taxes for people in the regions?
Oh, well, we'll be making our announcement as we work through a process, a very structured, methodical process to make sure we can say to the...
That's your ambition.
Well, look, the National Party, I mean, obviously we've been very proactive this term in making sure that many of the policy settings that are very important to Nationals, that we've led on that, but we're doing that in a responsible way, in making sure that we can still pay the bills for all Australians.
And you mentioned high income earners. Would you really want another tax cut for the highest income earners in Australia?
Well, it's important for us to remember that we gave the first two-stage tax cuts to lower middle income earners. The third one was about tax reform. It was about recalibrating and thinking about the future. Thinking about those that are at university today, they're going to get caught with higher taxes into the future because of bracket creep. And I think we're going to have to tackle it at some point, David. Otherwise, we're going to have a tax system that doesn't reward effort, and in fact, inflation is going to catch up to it. So why wouldn't we have the courage to say to Australians, we want you to be aspirational, we want you to go out, have a red hot crack and get ahead in life and be rewarded financially, but not have the penalty of the Australian tax man sitting over the top of you.
I want to ask you about energy. When you were in government, you were still keen on big renewables projects in the regions. You said you wanted your own electorate to become the renewable energy electorate. Western Downs Shire is screaming at me to become the renewable energy shire of the country with solar and wind, you said, and you talked up big solar projects in the Maranoa. Now you're not so keen. What's changed?
Well, so if you look at what's happened with renewables, those early stages of big renewable projects have been done where existing transmission lines are. So, and even the Grattan Institute's made this very clear. They've said that all the low-hanging fruit was done, and we went in very hard to make sure that we could get that, because obviously once you go beyond that, you're going on to greenfield sites. You're destroying the very thing we're trying to protect, the actual natural environment, and then you're also impacting many of the landholders with the transmission lines. While the landholders that might get the turbines and solar panels, they may get some financial benefit. Those with the transmission lines don't.
So will you cap them now? Will you put a cap on those projects?
Well, what we're going to do is obviously have a mix. To have an all renewables approach puts all your energy eggs in one basket. And when you've got a country with the sovereign ownership of all its resources like Australia, why would you have concentration risk? I mean,
but will you cap them? Because you said a couple of months ago that
so
you want to send the investment signal that there's a cap on where the coalition will go with renewables.
Well, if you put in baseload power and you shift some of that coal-fired into nuclear and you increase gas, and we're all going to have to increase a lot of gas, and that will be our solution to that transition is gas, then you actually do limit the amount of increased renewables put in it. That's just pure mathematics.
Will there be a cap?
Well, the market, as I said, you'll be sending the market signals. That's what governments do, David, is they send the market signals by sending those messages about how we're going to have our energy grid.
And does that signal involve a cap, a limit on how much renewables?
Well, not necessarily a hardline cap, but by us putting in place nuclear plants that the Australian people will own. That's going to, pure mathematics tell you that in fact what's going to happen is you're going to need less renewables, but we're going to need more gas.
So you want to tell investors less renewables?
We're going to tell investors that we're going to have an energy mix in this country.
And you want less investment from them in renewables?
Well, we'll be sending the actual mix of what we're looking for and what we want to achieve. And that's about making sure we have reliable, affordable power. But regional Australia's future shouldn't be one determined by billionaires, born billionaires with teal members of parliament that have an ideology telling regional Australia's future is to be littered with transmission lines, solar panels and wind turbines. That regional Australia wants a different future to that. We want to be part of the energy solution. Renewables is part of that. So too is gas, and so too will be nuclear.
And just related to that, the Future Made in Australia plans of the government to have subsidies and tax breaks to give mining a future in critical minerals processing and so on. Where are the Nats at on this?
So to underpin manufacturing in this country, you've got to have baseload, affordable, reliable power. Renewables can't do that. So there's no industrial country of our scale that has an all renewables approach that this Labor government is doing. So we have to give them confidence that they'll have baseload affordable power, we'll have proper industrial relations policies, and then we will be looking at some of those industries like critical minerals, and obviously we'll be making announcements closer to the election.
What does looking at mean though? Will you back what the government's doing?
Well, not giving billions of dollars to Twiggy Forrest, who's even walked away from it now for green hydrogen. But
a tax production credit means you get it if you're producing.
Yeah, well, we'll see the details of what we're going to propose well before the election.
Are you open to this idea?
Well, we're looking at all ideas, but making sure that you can't keep subsidising manufacturing industry in this country, because ultimately, at some point, Australian taxpayers' money runs out. So you've got to fix the fundamentals.
So you won't have subsidies?
No, you don't want them to be at the core of it. And whether you look at manufacturing, you look at the energy situation we're at the moment, it's subsidies that is trying to even keep the energy bills down of Australians now. At some point, Australian taxpayers' money runs out. You've got to fix the fundamentals. And that's why we're saying you start with that, and then you look at what can encourage to make sure that we keep that sector going and all sectors going without that subsidisation at some point.
Final one, gambling ads. Would you support a complete ban?
Well, look, we've already moved legislation that the Greens and Labor voted against, which was a ban an hour before and an hour after sporting events on TV. It is a complex area beyond TV, and I think we've got to sit down and we're prepared to work with the government online, as well as what happens at.
I mean, you've seen what's been reported where they're going on this: 2 ads an hour before, an hour after, no ads.
Yeah, and I'm prepared to sit down with them. I've been very clear with this. I find it offensive. I think this has actually been one issue that's been made by the gambling companies themselves if they'd taken a deep breath on their advertising and shoving odds and multi-odds down my and my kids' throat. I find it offensive. I've got to sit there before football and have someone tell me about a multi I could take. I just want to sit there and watch it with my kids, and I'll introduce them to gambling. I'm not a wowser, I enjoy a flutter, but I'll introduce gambling to my kids when I'm ready, not because I want to watch football. We've got to also look after free-to-air TV. They're under threat, and we need to make sure we get the balance right. So I think there is an opportunity for a bipartisan approach here to get this right, but the community is clearly telling us we've got to do something, and we've got to do something soon.
All right, Nationals leader David Littleproud, thanks for joining us this morning.
Thanks for having me.
Well, coming up, we are going to look at where the government's going to land on the gambling ads changes. The restriction's not a complete ban by the sounds of it, and it's not actually coming before Cabinet this week, I understand. Next month, we'll see more of the details. Let's get back to the panel, and just grab these microphones while I go. And just want to pick up with you on what we heard there on tax. And zonal tax is an idea that we haven't really debated much for a long time in Australia, but does sound like something might be in the works from the coalition in terms of lower income tax rates for the regions.
I mean, that's
You're from the regions?
Look, I mean, I can definitely understand why the coalition's going down this path, and this also builds into this broader view from the opposition at the moment that they really want to elevate the issues of the regions. They see that as a critical point that they can really attack Labor on, that it's not engaged in or understanding the pressures that regional communities are under. So I think we'll see a lot more of that into the lead up to the next election, and this is potentially a nice sweetener in terms of their engagement. But what does that mean for people in the suburbs of this country who are under such intense cost of living pressure?
And they're the seats the coalition's needing to win, right, in suburban Australia and outer suburban Australia.
I think you'll get more. I don't think you get changes in income tax rates. I think that's far too difficult and tricky. You might get some kind of special economic zone concessions on business taxes and things like that. I think that's a much more realistic proposition.
Tweaking the measures.
And it will not be, as to Anna's point, it won't be quite as sensitive to people in the suburbs.
Yeah, and look, just quickly too on energy there as well. Now, David Littleproud being a little bit more careful about capping renewable energy, but he's clearly wanting to limit renewable energy and send an investment signal to the market. Whoa.
Yeah, signal to the market was the phrase, and if you're going to buy 8 to 12 nuclear power plants, that's a fair signal going to the market, isn't it? You could do that in a way with what Jim was suggesting with zonal taxing. You set up economic zones around a nuclear power plant as some kind of incentive to that region. There's solar companies have tried to do the same thing. It happens internationally as well. The only problem with anything zonal like that is that you can hear the accountants that are all licking their lips at the moment at the prospect of people changing their address from their Sydney home to their country home and taking full advantage of the tax benefits.
I want to talk about the gambling ads because it struck me then that we are very, very likely, I think, to see bipartisanship around what's expected from the government, and that is not a complete ban. I'll bring up those figures I showed earlier from JWS Research. 53% are saying they want a complete ban. There were some polls done ages ago as well that showed similar strong results, but a complete ban doesn't look like it's coming. What are we going to see?
It's looking like, you know, we had Peter Dutton in his budget reply talking about a keenness to look at the hour before and after sporting events. We can see now, despite that really influential interjection from the late Peter Murphy, who'd been, you know, at the front line of trying to call for a complete ban, her husband this week talking about this, Rod Glover saying, you know, he wanted to see her ambitions realised, and some within Labor felt like they had a space to still raise that complete ban issue, but clearly it's a partial ban that we're going to land on with those additional measures, most likely of the 2 ads per hour.
And the reason it won't be a complete ban, according to one Cabinet Minister, Bill Shorten, is that revenue is critical, life or death, for the TV networks.
The problem is if you kill free-to-air media, what's going to replace it? And okay, I'm just going to say it. I don't want Mark Zuckerberg or Facebook in charge of my news feeds. He's not even paying the Australian media for what they report.
Well, I mean, for starters, the government could enforce its media bargaining code and require Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook to pay the media companies. But is that revenue from betting ads that critical for the TV networks?
It is, yeah, you bet. Particularly at the time we're facing at the moment, where revenues across the board are down. You'll see that in results that are coming out here and there. And admittedly, I'm one of those people that benefits from gambling.
But this is all media company, all commercial media companies, right?
Yeah, and SBS does as well, to be very upfront about that.
It is, and so do the sports leagues. And so we've seen this great development of junior sport. You've seen the AFLW come through, and that is in part funded by sports gambling, and that has been acknowledged by those in the cabinet. Now, look, no one wants to see 45 ads an hour or Tom Waterhouse back on the panel like was happening a decade ago that really sort of infiltrated this into the country. I think the Nationals have led on that, the Liberal Party has led on that, and that's where we'll see. We'll see regulation and we'll see education, and that's the way of preventing around this. The blanket ban, look at poker machines. You know, there's no ads for poker machines anywhere in the country, and revenues keep going up. The blanket ban won't work, and what it will do is put pressure on international black market organisations, and it will take money away from one segment of this industry that is providing jobs as well.
Well, I agree that it would obviously have a bad impact on both sporting organisations and media companies. But I'm a little sceptical that you can have, be a little bit pregnant in this sense, or that you can allow some ads and everything will be much better. I don't actually think it will. I agree that the betting companies just absolutely went over the top, and everybody, most of the population is really irritated about this now, as everybody should be. I'm just very sceptical, I suppose, that suddenly the government is, for example, is terribly concerned about the fate of media companies. That has not really been an issue before. They could reduce some of the spectrum payments. They could do other things if they're that concerned about that. I do think the issue of the money that sporting organisations have used this money for is obviously, it's very important for them. They can do good things with it. But again, I don't know. I think they've just become a bit addicted to it, and it's a very kind of easy money.
The problem with this revenue stream is, it's for an industry that we know is causing some problem. And, I spoke for the podcast this week to Martin Thomas. He's the CEO of the Alliance for Gambling Reform, and he kind of laid out the impact the problem gambling is having.
We know it also causes mental health issues. The research shows that if you have a gambler in the family with a problem, 3 times more likely to have domestic violence. And there's some report that says even as many as 20% or as much as 20% of suicides in Australia are linked to gambling.
Yeah, so you can watch that full podcast interview or listen to it. The QR codes are there for that. But that's the case that's being put by the anti-gambling and also crossbenchers and backbenchers as well. I just want to talk about the politics there, Anna, because it's not an insignificant number of Labor backbenchers who want the Peter Murphy Committee recommendations, which, a rare event, a bipartisan recommendation for a complete ban. That's what they want.
That's what they want, and they say they're going to keep on talking to cabinet ministers about that view and try and pursue it. And that's why this week I think that space was created for them to have a chance to lay that argument out. And the government, in terms of the front bench, is trying to have those conversations quietly through committee processes, sitting down in rooms with those who are at the front line of this.
But they're not budging?
It doesn't seem like they are. More managing the way they're delivering the message, I would say, is the way it's being seen. But the other thing about this whole process, which isn't just about this legislation, but I think is worth noting, is these non-disclosure agreements that everybody is having to sign in terms of having access to this legislation or little parts.
On so many pieces of legislation under this government, it must be said.
And of course it doesn't work because the details get out anyway. But I think it's it means people aren't supposed to talk about it. I think it's a very bad development.
The debate is just really, has a lid on it, and it's really frustrating for those trying to get a message out because they know information, they're under threat of being sued if they speak about it. It's hard for the public to get a good handle on what's happening.
Yeah, and also in terms of problem gambling, obviously that is a terribly serious problem. It is a very small percentage of the population, but I think what's been happening in the last few years and why people are so concerned is that it's normalising much more betting than we ever considered was a good idea. As David Littleproud said, people like a bit of a flutter. But then the idea that you're betting on watching absolutely everything, and thinking this is absolutely normal. This is how you watch sport. You have to bet.
You have to discuss the odds. Yeah, that's why you regulate and you educate that it's not part of the way and you get it outside. But isn't this the same with what we've been doing with poker machines? We said there's no advertising for that, revenue's going up. And the lotto. That report carves out the lotteries, which is weekly, everyone gets the ads. You see
Lots
it on
of ads for
TV.
them, yeah.
You can buy your ticket with a credit card, so you can spend money you don't have for the chance of winning money you won't win, and that's all legitimate. But we're taking it away from this side.
I guess sport is a particular thing.
I understand. It needs change.
I think it's pretty clear, though, this morning, again, listening to David Littleproud, we will see an agreement on this in the weeks to come. One area where we didn't see agreement during the past week, maybe we will tomorrow when Parliament's back, is the CFMEU. After all the problems that were exposed there, the government, brought in this legislation to appointed ministers, to legally require administrators to go in. It really wanted to get this done as quickly as possible, but it didn't. What happened there, Charles? What are the sticking points?
The sticking point involves time and also the authority of the administrator. In a lot of ways, there are also the ability of the CFMEU to make political donations and exactly how much they can donate and when they can donate. And the Labor Party has said they won't accept, but that moving into the future, one of the sticking points would be whether you can actually restrict an organisation like the CFMEU from making a donation if that's firstly constitutionally legal, and that would likely cause a...
And even if there is a constitutional question over putting a donations ban in this bill, that could bog it down in the courts for quite a while.
Yeah, for time, and then also you get to the phase where you're going to ban Clive Palmer from donating or Climate 200 from donating. Like, how do you go around that in the future? Something will come at this. The Liberal Party aren't going to miss an opportunity to restrict the power of the CFMEU eventually. The question is how much damage is it doing to Labor in the meantime, and how much can they get out of it? Around timing, I think it's 3 to 5 years seems to be the sticking point for that.
I think that's probably the most likely area that we'll see a bit of movement, because the Libs are saying it has to be a minimum 3 years of administration. Labor's saying, well, if individual branches like the WA or ACT branch are cleaned up, they should be able to get back to regular business. But I think that'll be the area where you see a bit of movement. Anyway, I just want to show you this because the week ended with both sides accusing each other of being soft on the CFMEU.
Murray Watt's got to ask himself, and the Prime Minister needs to answer this question. Are you serious about cleaning up organised crime and the CFMEU and its impact on the construction industry?
It's nearly beer o'clock and John Setka is having a beer. He might even be having a champagne, he's that happy, because of what the Coalition and the Greens just did to let him and his colleagues off the hook.
And Jennifer, the industry is tearing its hair out here as well. They're pretty keen for the Libs just to get on it back.
Well, of course, but I must say, I wrote earlier this week that the Labor ministers deserved a special acting prize for being shocked, absolutely shocked, that there was thuggery, corruption and criminality in the CFMEU. Yeah. They have conveniently ignored that. They abolished the regulator for the industry. So, suddenly be really appalled.
But the regulator, the ABCC, didn't find all these problems.
Yes, but they should have given them more powers. But the idea that this has suddenly happened and Labor's suddenly aware of this when they have been knowing that they've been taking them up.
And those debates about bringing back a body, maybe a stronger, tougher body, that'll happen before the election. But right now, to get administrators in there and stop the rot.
Yes, there'll be a deal.
Need to back it, don't they?
Yeah, of course they'll back it. They'll just kind of how much pressure they'll put on for it to make it tougher. I mean, I must say, I did think it was pretty optimistic of the government to think that they could have a maximum of 3 years and the minister could decide when it was all okay.
Yeah, or the administrator decide when it's all okay.
Wasn't helpful for John Setka's photo to emerge this week with his new tattoo either. What did it say? The CFMEU, God forgives, the CFMEU doesn't. It just kind of was another note that Labor doesn't necessarily have all the control here and that there are a lot of moving parts.
No, indeed. Now, the New South Wales Liberals, this has to go down as backroom political stuff-up of the year. They've failed to lodge the nomination forms before the set deadline for about more than 130 local government candidates in New South Wales. Whoops. As I mentioned earlier in the news section, there's a bit of talk about whether they're going to try and challenge this in the courts, but I mean, the Electoral Commission were very clear about the deadline. It was missed. The party state director, Richard Shields, was sacked as a result of this stuff-up, and the state leader, Mark Speakman, he summed it up for what it was.
This is a debacle. There's no other way to describe it. And it means that, unfortunately, we won't be running Liberal Party candidates in a number of local government areas across New South Wales.
What happened?
This is extraordinary. I mean, I've spoken to so many people who are just aghast at how this unfolded. Essentially, the nomination forms, clearly there was a backlog. There weren't enough staff processing them. People were announcing candidacy but knew their nomination hadn't yet been filled out.
And head office is meant to look after all the nomination forms. That's what
they have to sign them off. So it sort of has to funnel through that process, as I understand it. And then all these forms just weren't filed by the deadline. Richard Shield said he, wasn't aware that he had to run this whole process himself. He thought that there was still time, and then he was unfortunately photographed just before the deadline, because he's also the mayor of Woollahra, at a local park next to a slippery slide, which is giving like the thick of it vibes. But this extraordinary photo emerged, was quickly taken down by the council, but just raised these questions about what he's doing with his time.
So the broader issue really is the state, the dysfunction and the incompetence of the state Liberal Party organisations, and that is a big problem. It's a big problem in New South Wales, it's a big problem in Victoria, South Australia. WA is only just trying to come back from being completely decimated and a terrible organisation there. I mean, that is the bigger problem for Peter Dutton, kind of federally. What does this say about the organisation?
It means they won't have Liberal councillors in a whole bunch of councils where they fail to get the nominations in. But what it means federally, someone was telling me this yesterday, you look at where they've stuffed up and won't have any Liberals running for council. It includes areas where a lot of federal seats that are critical in the coming election overlap. Bennelong, Lindsay, Robertson, Dobell, Hunter, Patterson. I mean, you can't think of more relevant seats in New South Wales that are going to be in play at this election.
And in some of those outer regional seats, the mayor is a big figure and someone that can dominate local media markets and really make a name for themselves. So many of them.
And your ground game in the campaign, you need all that.
And beyond any of that, it's just having a presence and having the brand out there. And as Jennifer said, this is something that has impacted, remember last federal election when the New South Wales Liberal Party waited until the very last minute and in some cases beyond with legal challenges to get candidates in. There are those in the Liberal Party that think it costs them seats at the federal level.
So this is not just a one-off. This is, another example, a particularly spectacular example of incompetence, which is dogging these parties.
Yeah, it is. Look, we'll see if there's a court challenge. We'll see if anything's fixed as a result of that. But are you saying they need a more serious clean out of organisational wing of the Liberal Party?
Like from the last election, it's obviously the New South Wales Liberal Party has been in dire straits. It was supposed to never happen again. They've been fighting all the time. And again, you've got in Victoria what's going on there. I mean, this is a real severe problem for the Liberal Party federally.
And they've come from a long period of being in government, both at state and federal level. These are people that should know the process and should be on top of their game. Some of them have been ministers that are in charge of this. It's a mess, but one that there is no obvious solution.
Well, personal animosity as well. That's
personal animosity and factional
people
fighting.
pitted against each other. These are the people running it at a state level. Really important, as we know, in the next election. And right now, there's certainly a lot of people pointing the finger of blame at each other.
Oh, yeah. All right. Our panel, Jennifer Hewett, Charles Croucher and Anna Henderson will be back very shortly with some final observations. Time now, though, for Mike Bowers and Talking Pictures.
I'm Mike Bowers and I'm photographer at large for The Guardian Australia. I'm talking pictures this morning with Channel 9 political reporter Amanda Copp. Very warm welcome back.
Thank you very much, Mike.
Amanda, some weeks in Parliament it's Watford with a capital WT, and this was one of those weeks, wasn't it?
It sure was, and there was a lot going on.
Peter Dutton likes to claim that he stopped the boats, and this time he stopped the refugees, or wants to, from Gaza.
Look, we saw some pretty heated scenes in the House of Representatives.
There certainly does seem to be, from the opposition, a wall of noise that comes up against the independents and the Teals that is not present for others.
It's a very intense debate, right? Emotions are running high.
It's like a kindergarten class.
Zali Steggall, I don't think I have ever seen her that angry.
It was interesting, Tanya Plibersek led the government over to go and sit with her when she was still up talking.
No one likes being interrupted, and so I'm sure there's some of these women sitting here being like, why am I even here?
What am I doing here? Beautiful David Rowe cartoon, The Dogs of War.
Racism and bigotry. I think this was a great representation of dog whistles.
Yes.
What's that whistle?
Ooh, Dutton. They're pretty mangy looking dogs of war, these two.
One of the small things that I liked here was the briefcase with Australian visa discarded in the rubble over here.
Fiona Katauskas has sort of hit the nail on the head. They could be Hamas, says Netanyahu.
They could be, Hamas says, the food and medical aid trying to cross the border.
They could be, Hamas says Peter Dutton, no refugees from Gaza. And here are the actual refugees.
Saying they talk about what we could be, but never about what we are.
Starving, homeless, injured, traumatised, exhausted, in desperate need of help, which sometimes it takes a cartoonist to actually condense these things into a real point that sort of hits you in the face like a punch. Lovely Kathy Wilcox. I'm a bit worried we might be alienating the Muslim voters with our stance on Gaza.
And then we've got Peter Dutton here. Hold my beer.
And about to take a big breath and blow in the whistle, I think. I love this, Matt Golding. Today's Dutton risk is dog whistle, divide, inflame and new low.
I don't think you're starting from a very good base when the lowest possible thing you have is dog whistle.
It only gets worse from that point onwards. Mark Knight has got Peter Dutton pulling in the welcome mat. How silly of me, when there's a war on, I should have taken you in.
Oh, thank you, they say.
As he whips away the welcome mat and slams the door.
Yeah, certainly not rolling out the welcome mat here.
It certainly isn't. I did love Brett Lethbridge. He's got the Dut gun as immigration ray gun here, doing a little dance for Mr Albanese.
And Albanese saying, you're really dividing opinion in Australia. You know, I was so happy that Reagan got a shout out here.
Yeah.
Breakdancing. It's gone out with a blaze of glory.
Beautiful Kadelka. He's got So When's Been Night.
No idea. The mayor's a Liberal.
This is referring to the fact that the Liberal Party missed the deadline for nominating local council election candidates.
They sure did. And someone who's not very good at administration, I have a lot of sympathy for them.
Certainly the state executive took out the trash when they sacked the Liberal director, Richard Shields.
Yeah, but who's going to pick it up with, bin night still happening?
Yeah, the government might have hoped for a win on gambling reforms, but the odds aren't looking good, Amanda. I felt sorry for this poor little kid. Lovely Glenn Leliva cartoon.
Yeah, he's looking pretty miserable here.
He's just overwhelmed by all the betting ads.
Bit of a change from when you used to have your sporting heroes up on your walls.
This is a lovely Matt Golding and right on target. It's if the media is free, you are the product.
Very true. And look, it's not just sports betting. Same thing happens with social media as well. Facebook, Instagram, it's the same concept.
All of it, yeah. Matt Bissett-Johnson, he's got the media saying if only the human cost wasn't so profitable.
Look, no comment, Mike.
I think that's probably very wise. It's been a great pleasure unpicking events this week. I'll let you do the honours.
Thanks very much, Mike. Back to you, Spearsy.
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you, Mike. Time for some final observations. Quickly from me, an update on some big reforms, big pieces of legislation. The NDIS deal looks like it's done or about done between Labor and the Coalition, not necessarily with the states, but we might see that announced as early as tomorrow to rein in the growth costs of the NDIS. Aged care is very much up in the air, very unclear whether that's going to happen. The more user pays model that the government wants to do, they're still working behind the scenes with the Coalition on that. And Future Made in Australia, they will bring in the legislation. They're not going to get the support, but the legislation put the guardrails around it. They'll put it up for a vote anyway. So a bit to come in the coming week. Jennifer.
Yes, well also this coming week, many Australian universities and colleges have become financially addicted to international student money. They were encouraged to do that by successive governments, despite often this leading to terrible experiences for domestic students. But now, of course, that migration has become such a hot issue, the government's desperately trying to rein international students back in. So they're going to announce some details of those caps this week and prepare for many more screams of outrage from universities about what this is going to mean to their budgets and who's going to fill the gap.
Yeah, it's going to be fascinating. Their budgets, the soft diplomacy aspect of international students in Australia and the economy generally. That'll be really interesting. Charles.
I'm cheating and going overseas. The Democratic National Convention kicks off this week. It'll be on Tuesday. Kamala Harris has had a dream run since effectively taking over from Joe Biden. But to steal a line from Mike Pence, Vice Presidents are well known but not known well. This is the best opportunity for her team to reintroduce her to the electorate in America. And while that's all happening in Chicago, I suspect there'll be someone watching in Mar-a-Lago that won't allow 4 days of unvetted Democratic propaganda to get to there. So keep an eye on Donald Trump.
And Kamala Harris's big speech is Friday our time.
Friday our time, fourth day of the convention.
Will she do any interviews? We'll wait and see.
Anna.
Look, I'm understanding that there's a lot of foot traffic at the moment going to the door of the new Minister for Indigenous Australians, Malarndirri McCarthy. She's under a lot of pressure from within the Indigenous leadership in the community to chart a path forward after what's transpired over the time that they've been in Parliament so far and government so far. And also this week, the Missing and Murdered First Nations Women's Committee report was handed down. It described the situation as an epidemic. Those who push for the inquiry, including Green Senator Dorinda Cox, are not happy with the recommendations. They don't think they go far enough. One of the issues that was raised there, which I think we should all be reflecting on, is how these cases have been reported in the media. And whether or not the people at the centre of these cases and their families are being respected adequately, and these stories are being told appropriately and well in the Australian media, which is something that I think is well worth everyone thinking about.
Yeah, good reminder. Thank you all very much for joining us this morning. Finally, you couldn't have scripted this one. A Senate hearing on artificial intelligence interrupted by artificial intelligence. A Google representative was explaining how responsible the company is being with AI, how this new tech is all under control, when the AI itself jumped in. We'll leave you with that. Thanks for watching.
At Google, we take a responsible approach at each stage of the AI lifecycle. This approach starts with research to inform model development that encompasses topics such as data protection and adversarial
Let's
testing.
explore responsible AI across the lifecycle. That's a great statement.
There is Google stepping in to be responsible on my side.
You're making us all feel very excited about being here.